The chamber exists 47 steps below the Temple of Ammon at Karnak, carved into living bedrock over 300 years. Before this moment, sealed from the world above by doors of cedarwood reinforced with bronze that have not been open to daylight in living memory. The year is approximately 1214 years before the Common Era, the 19th year of Pharaoh Ramesses II. And the woman on the obsidian altar has been awake for 6 days. Her name is Kia of Mitanni. She is 22 years old. She was, until 31 days ago, a noblewoman of the Mitanni kingdom, daughter of a provincial governor, educated in languages and astronomy and the proper conduct of a woman of rank. She was captured when Egyptian forces overwhelmed her father's garrison during the campaigns in Syria. She was transported in a wooden cage across 400 meters of desert, examined by physicians who documented every detail of her physical condition, evaluated by priests who tested her responses to stimuli that she did not understand, and finally selected for what the temple records call divine service of the highest order. She has learned what that phrase means. She can feel the cold of the obsidian beneath her bare back, and can feel the leather straps cutting into her wrists and ankles where they have rubbed the skin raw. Over 6 days of confinement to this stone, she can smell the acrid smoke of burning keef incense mixed with something else, something organic and wrong that catches in the back of her throat and makes her gag, even though her stomach has been empty for 3 days. She can hear the chanting of the 7 priests who stand in a circle around the altar, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seem designed to disorient rather than to pray. Their words were in a dialect of Egyptian so old that even native speakers would struggle to understand it. She can see the instruments arranged on the smaller altar beside her copper implements, whose purposes she has learned through 6 days of direct experience. Obsidian blades that catch the lamplight with edges sharp enough to split a single hair. Ceramic vessels containing substances that burn when applied to skin. Bronze tools shaped for purposes that no physician would recognize. Glass vials holding liquids that induce states she has no words to describe. The high priest approaches. His name is Usuzer Montu. He has served in this chamber for 31 years. He has performed these rituals on over 200 women. He will perform them on Kia for another 8 days before she is judged ready for the final ceremony. He does not see her as a person. The records he keeps, fragments of which survive in museum archives today, describe her the way a craftsman might describe raw material being shaped into a finished product. Subject responsive but resistant. Baseline psychological structure largely intact. Recommend extended protocol with emphasis on identity dissolution. Projected readiness 14 days from intake. What Kier does not yet know what she will learn over the next 8 days in ways that words cannot adequately convey that she is not being punished. She is being prepared. The rituals being performed on her body and mind are not torture in the sense of extracting information or imposing suffering as a penalty for crimes. They are transformation. They are the systematic destruction of everything she was so that she can become something else. A vessel empty of self, capable of housing whatever the priests choose to place inside her. 83% of women who entered this chamber never emerged with their personalities intact. 61% died within 5 years of completing the rituals, their bodies simply giving up after their minds had already departed. 12% survived physically for decades but were described in temple records as present but empty, breathing, walking, and eating when fed, but showing no evidence of internal experience or independent thought. And 7%, the ones the priests considered their greatest successes, became something that defies modern psychological categories. They became oracles, priestesses, and vessels through which the gods supposedly spoke. They prophesied, they healed, and they channeled divine wisdom for the benefit of pharaohs and commoners alike. They were venerated throughout Egypt for the sacred power they carried. But the temple records also note in clinical language that has disturbed every modern scholar who has translated them that these 7% no longer contained the original occupant. The woman who entered the chamber was gone. What emerged was something else wearing her body, speaking with her voice, and moving through the world with her face. But fundamentally, irrevocably, not her. This is what the Egyptian high priests did to captive women during secret rituals that the ancient world kept hidden for 3,000 years. This is what Hollywood cannot show you. Because the reality is not dramatic violence that ends in death. It is systematic psychological destruction that continues for weeks or months or years. Transforming human beings into empty vessels through methods that modern neuroscientists recognize as targeting the precise brain structures responsible for identity and selfhood. This is what you were never taught. What you were about to learn has been suppressed, mistranslated, and deliberately obscured since the moment it was first documented over 3,000 years ago. You know about ancient Egypt. You have seen the pyramids, the golden treasures, and the elaborate tombs filled with artifacts that speak of a civilization obsessed with eternal life. You have learned about pharaohs and gods and the Nile flooding each year to renew the land. You have encountered the romantic version, mysterious, exotic, and fascinating in its strangeness, but ultimately comprehensible as an ancient culture with different beliefs than our own. But you have never learned about the chambers beneath the temples. You have never heard about the systematic processing of captive women that the priests called divine preparation. You have never encountered the fragmentary records that describe in clinical detail what happened to hundreds of women over centuries of Egyptian religious practice. Records that have been known to scholars for over 100 years but have never been translated for general audiences because their content was considered too disturbing for public consumption. Tonight, you will discover why certain temple complexes contained underground chambers with no windows and no natural light, accessible only through passages that could be sealed from inside. Why the priestly class maintains detailed records of physical and psychological transformations in language that modern psychiatrists immediately recognize as describing induced dissociative states. Why captive women from conquered territories were evaluated not for their labor value or their beauty, but for specific psychological characteristics that the priests believed made them suitable vessels for divine occupation. You will learn about the 5-stage preparation protocol documented in Papi that has been locked in museum archives since its discovery in 1874. You will learn what the stages were called, what each stage involved, and what modern neuroscience reveals about why these specific techniques would produce the effects the ancient priests claimed to achieve. You will learn about Kia of Mitanni, who endured 14 days of preparation and emerged as something the records describe as no longer the foreign woman, but the voice of Mut. About Nefertari of Kush, who resisted longer than any recorded subject and was finally broken through methods that the priests considered so extreme they documented them as warnings for future use. About Isit Nafret of Canaan, who died during preparation and whose death sparked the only recorded reform of temple practices in 3 centuries. About Tizera of Libya, who pretended to be broken while secretly maintaining her identity, who planned an escape that nearly succeeded and whose punishment, when discovered, was recorded in such detail that the papyrus was sealed in its own container with warnings not to read it unless absolutely necessary. You will learn what modern archaeology has discovered in the ruins of these temple chambers, the physical evidence that confirms what the written records describe, the residue of substances whose effects modern pharmacologists can now identify in the skeletal remains that show evidence of prolonged confinement and specific forms of physical intervention. Subscribe if you want to understand what ancient civilizations actually did behind the walls of their most sacred spaces. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from, because Kia is still lying on that obsidian altar. And user Montu is approaching with the implements for the 7th day of her preparation. And I am going to tell you exactly what happened in that chamber, what the priests documented, what the victims experienced, and what the evidence reveals about practices that the ancient world kept hidden because even they understood that some truths were too dark for ordinary people to know. But first, I need to explain how these women came to be in these chambers at all. The Egyptian temple complexes maintained networks of scouts and evaluators throughout the territories that Egypt controlled or contested. These were not slave traders in the conventional sense. They were specialists, priests trained in recognizing specific characteristics that the temple hierarchy believed indicated suitability for divine service. When Egyptian armies conquered new territories or raided border regions, these specialists accompanied the military forces, while soldiers collected ordinary captives destined for labor or domestic service. The temple evaluators moved through the captured population looking for something different. The criteria were specific and documented in training texts that survive in fragmentary form. Age between 18 and 30 years. Physical health without significant defect. Evidence of prior education or training in complex skills. Capacity for emotional response when subjected to sudden stimuli. Evidence of strong will or resistance. This characteristic was considered essential because the priests believed that vessels needed to contain something before they could be emptied. The initial evaluation happened in the field within days of capture. Women who passed this preliminary assessment were separated from the general captive population and transported to regional temple complexes for more thorough examination. Kia of Mitanni was identified during the sack of her father's fortress in what is now northern Syria. An Egyptian evaluator noted her responses during the chaos of the assault. How she attempted to organize other women for escape. How she continued functioning when others collapsed into paralysis. How she maintained composure even when her plans failed and she was taken. The evaluator's report survives in fragmentary form. Subject 23, a female approximately 22 years old, is the daughter of a provincial administrator. Physical specifications acceptable. Linguistic capability is exceptional. Observe speaking 3 languages during capture. The psychological profile indicates strong will, high intelligence, and capacity for sustained resistance. Recommendation to transport to Karnak for full evaluation, projected suitability. High Kia was not randomly selected. She was specifically chosen because she possessed characteristics the priests believed would make her a powerful vessel once those characteristics were destroyed and redirected. Her strength of will was not an obstacle to be overcome. It was a resource to be harvested. The transport to Egypt took 31 days. Kia traveled in a wooden cage mounted on a cart, exposed to sun and sand during the day and too cold during desert nights. She was fed minimally enough to maintain health, not enough to maintain strength. She was not permitted to speak with other captives or with her guards. She was kept in deliberate isolation from the moment of capture, beginning the process of separation from her previous identity before she even arrived at the temple. Modern psychologists who have analyzed these transport protocols recognize them as the first stage of what is now called coercive control, the systematic isolation that makes later psychological manipulation more effective. The priests may not have understood the neuroscience, but they understood empirically that women who arrived alone, weakened, and cut off from all previous social connections were more susceptible to the procedures that followed. Approximately 1,500 women per year were transported to major temple complexes throughout Egypt during the height of the New Kingdom. Of these, perhaps 300 were selected for the intensive preparation protocols. The others were assigned to less demanding forms of temple service, labor, maintenance, and attendance to lower-ranking priestesses. Only those identified as having the highest potential were sent to the underground chambers. Kie was among the highest potential candidates the Karnak complex had received in years. Her file was marked with symbols indicating that the senior priests should be notified of her arrival symbols that meant she would receive personal attention from user Montu himself. She arrived at Karnak on the 32nd day after her capture, weak from the journey, disoriented from weeks of isolation, and still believing that her situation could not possibly be as bad as she feared. She was wrong. The evaluation facility at Karnak occupied a building adjacent to the main temple complex, connected by underground passages that allowed priests to move between structures without being observed by ordinary worshippers. The building appeared unremarkable from outside a storage structure, perhaps, or administrative offices. Its true purpose was known only to initiates of the inner priesthood. Kia was brought to this facility on the evening of her arrival, washed for the first time since her capture, fed a meal that seemed generous after weeks of minimal rations, and given clean linen to wear. These kindnesses were not mercy. They were preparing the establishment of a contrast between deprivation and comfort that would be used throughout the preparation protocol to keep subjects psychologically off balance. The evaluation began the following morning and continued for 3 days. The physical examination was thorough in ways that the surviving documents describe with clinical precision. Physicians, priest-physicians who served the temple hierarchy, documented every aspect of her body using standardized forms that had been refined over centuries of practice. Height, weight, proportions of limbs and torso, condition of skin and hair and teeth, flexibility of joints, and response to temperature and pressure and pain. They tested her vision and hearing. They examined her internally using methods that the documents describe in terms explicit for translation, but whose nature is unmistakable from context. The psychological evaluation was even more thorough. They tested her reactions to sudden loud noises, to unexpected physical contact, and 2 periods of darkness followed by bright light. They questioned her about her childhood, her family, her beliefs, and her fears, questions that seemed conversational but that the priests recorded in detail for later analysis. They showed her images and objects and asked her to describe what she saw, what she felt, and what she thought. They told her stories and asked her to continue them, analyzing her narrative choices for evidence of psychological patterns they could exploit. They deliberately provoked her insults to her people, claims about her family, and suggestions about her future that were designed to elicit anger or despair or resistance. Her responses were documented. Women who showed no resistance were often rejected at this stage, considered unsuitable because they lacked the psychological substance that the preparation protocol was designed to harvest. The evaluation records for Kia survive in fragmentary form. Subject displays exceptional resistance capacity. Anger responses are controlled but powerful. Fear response is present but subordinated to analytical function. Identity strongly rooted in cultural and familial connections. Recommends full preparation protocol with emphasis on identity dissolution. Projected timeline 14 to 21 days. Suitability rating exceptional. The phrase identity dissolution appears repeatedly in temple preparation documents. Modern psychologists recognize it immediately. The priests were not trying to break their subjects' wills in the simple sense of forcing compliance. They were trying to destroy the fundamental sense of self that allows a human being to experience themselves as a continuous person across time, the psychological substrate of identity itself. The techniques they used for this purpose were sophisticated, consistent, and apparently effective. What Kia was about to experience had been refined over centuries of practice, tested on hundreds of women, and documented in records that the priests maintained with the precision of experimental scientists recording the results of repeated trials. She was assigned to Chamber 7 in the underground complex. She was given the number 147, subject of the current year. She was told that her previous name no longer applied, that she would not hear it again, and that speaking it herself would result in the protocol being extended indefinitely. She was taken below. The first stage of the preparation protocol was called the severing of temple documents, a name that describes its purpose precisely. Everything that connected the subject to her previous identity was to be cut away, leaving her psychologically adrift without the anchors that normally allow humans to maintain a stable sense of self. For Kia, the severing began within hours of her descent to Chamber 7. The chamber itself was designed to disorient. The walls were painted black, absorbing the light from oil lamps that burned constantly but dimly. The floor was stone, cold enough to draw heat from bare feet. There were no windows, no natural light, and no way to track the passage of time. The only furniture was the obsidian altar in the center. A black slab, approximately the size of a human body, equipped with leather straps at positions corresponding to wrists, ankles, waist, and neck. She was not placed on the altar immediately. First, she was required to stand in the center of the chamber while priests circled her chanting in the ancient dialect, removing her linen garment piece by piece until she stood. Exposed, unable to cover herself, unable to escape the eyes that examined her from every angle. Then came the first physical intervention. The temple records describe it as the removal of identifying features, a phrase that sounds almost bureaucratic until you understand what it meant. The hair was first. Every strand of hair on her body was removed using copper razors and pumice stones, a process that took approximately 5 hours and that the records note was to be conducted without allowing the subject to make any sound. Modern dermatologists who have analyzed the described techniques confirm that they would have been extraordinarily painful. Copper razors of the period were sharp, but not sharp enough to cut cleanly without dragging and pulling. Pumice stones used on skin would have caused abrasion and bleeding in sensitive areas. The 5-hour duration meant that the pain was not a brief shock, but a sustained experience that would have exhausted the subject's capacity to process it. But the physical pain was secondary to the psychological purpose. The prohibition on sound forced Kia into a pattern of suppression that began training her to disconnect from her own responses. Each time she stifled a cry of pain, she was practicing the separation of experience from expression that the protocol was designed to induce. By the end of the 5 hours, she had learned on a physical level that her own reactions were not to be trusted, that what she felt was not to be acknowledged, and that the connection between internal experience and external expression was something she must sever. When the hair removal was complete, she was placed in a bath of natron solution, the same substance used in mummification, a harsh alkaline compound that burned living skin with a searing intensity that the records describe as sufficient to command complete attention. She was required to remain in the bath for 2 hours. The burns this caused would heal over the following days, but the nerve damage in some areas would be permanent, leaving patches of skin that were either hypersensitive or partially numb. A physical reminder of this experience that would persist for the rest of her life. Throughout the bath, the chanting continued. The phrases were repeated again and again, installing themselves in her mind through sheer repetition. You are being purified. You are becoming empty. The foreign woman dies so that the vessel may be born. You are not what you were. You are becoming what we make you. Modern psychologists recognize this technique as a form of what is now called ideological programming, the use of repetitive verbal content during states of extreme stress to install new beliefs that bypass normal critical evaluation. When the mind is overwhelmed by pain or fear, it becomes more susceptible to suggestion. The priests understood this empirically and exploited it systematically. When Kia emerged from the natron bath, she was physically transformed, hairless, raw-skinned, and visibly different from the woman who had descended to the chamber hours before. But the severing was only beginning. The protocol continued for another 4 days before moving to the second stage. The remaining days of the severing stage focused on breaking the subject's remaining connections to her previous identity. On the second day, Kia was required to recount her life story while priests listened without response. She spoke for hours. Her childhood, her family, her education, her hopes, her fears, everything that made her who she was. When she finished, the priests informed her that everything she had said was false. There was no such person as the one she described. The memories she claimed were implanted fictions. The family she believed she had never existed. She protested. Of course, she protested. Her memories were real. Her identity was real. She knew who she was. The priests responded with what they called correction, a process that continued for approximately 12 hours. Every time she asserted something about her past, she was punished. The punishment was not violent in the dramatic sense. It was precise. A device applied to specific points on the body that produced intense but transient pain. A period of confinement in a space so small she could not straighten her limbs. Exposure to temperature extremes and deprivation of water until her lips cracked and her throat burned. By the end of the 12 hours, she was no longer asserting her memories. She was simply enduring, waiting for it to stop, no longer investing energy in claims that only brought suffering. This was the desired result. The priests were not trying to convince her that her memories were false. They were trying to break the connection between her memories and her sense of self to make her previous identity. Something she no longer automatically defended, no longer experienced as essential to who she was. On the third day, she was shown objects from her previous life items recovered during her capture. Personal possessions that had been transported to Egypt specifically for this purpose. She was required to destroy them one by one. Her jewelry was melted. Her clothing was burned. A letter she had been carrying from her mother was torn into pieces before her eyes. With each destruction, the priest chanted, "The foreign woman dies. The vessel is born. What was is gone. What will be is coming." The trauma of watching her possessions destroyed was deliberately compounded by the requirement that she participate. She was the one who dropped the jewelry into the fire. She was the one who tore the letter. Each act of destruction was an act of complicity, a betrayal of her previous self that implicated her in her own transformation. Modern psychologists who have studied coercive control in cults and abusive relationships recognize this technique as induced complicity, forcing victims to participate in their own victimization in ways that create shame and psychologically bind them to their abusers. The priests may not have known the mechanism, but they knew the effect. On the fourth and fifth days, Kia was subjected to what the records call memory dissolution, extended periods of sensory deprivation, alternating with overwhelming sensory stimulation. She was placed in a small chamber with no light and no sound for approximately 8 hours, then removed to the main chamber where drums and chanting and bright lights assaulted her senses for approximately 2 hours, then to return to darkness in silence. The cycle repeated throughout both days. Modern neuroscience explains what this does to the brain. Extended sensory deprivation causes the brain to generate its own stimuli, hallucinations, distortions of time, and confusion about what is real and what is imagined. The alternation with overwhelming stimulation prevents the brain from adapting to either state, keeping it in a condition of continuous stress that impairs the consolidation of memory and destabilizes the sense of self. By the end of the fifth day, Kia was no longer certain what was real. Her memories of her previous life felt distant, uncertain, and possibly false. Her sense of continuous identity, the feeling that she was the same person from moment to moment, had become fragile and unstable. She was ready for the second stage. The records document her condition at the transition point. Subject 147 has achieved primary severance, identity markers significantly weakened, memory access impaired, resistance capacity reduced but not eliminated. Recommend transition to stage 2 with standard intensity projected completion in 7 to 10 days. The second stage of the preparation protocol was called the opening. In temple, documents a name that described the psychological condition the priest sought to create. Having severed the subject's connections to her previous identity, they now sought to open her to new content, making her receptive to whatever they chose to install. For Kia, the opening began on the 6th day of her preparation. The chamber for this stage was different from the one used for severing. It was larger, with multiple altars arranged in a configuration that seemed to have astronomical significance. The altars were positioned to correspond with celestial bodies, though Kia had no way of knowing this without seeing the sky. The walls were covered with hieroglyphic texts that appeared to be prayers or incantations. Though in the ancient dialect, she could not fully understand them. She was placed on the central altar, the obsidian slab described at the beginning of this account, and secured with the leather straps that allowed no movement beyond the rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. The opening began with what the records call physical preparation for reception. Modern scholars who have analyzed these texts disagree about exactly what this involved. But the descriptions make clear that it included intervention with the body in ways designed to produce specific psychological states. Substances were applied to the skin in ointments and oils whose composition can be partially reconstructed from the ingredients listed in the records. Some of these substances appear to have had psychoactive properties absorbed through the skin and producing alterations in consciousness that the priests attributed to divine presence, but that modern pharmacology recognizes as drug effects. Other physical interventions targeted the nervous system directly. The records mention points of power on the body, where pressure or stimulation produced specific responses. Modern neuroscience recognizes some of these points as corresponding to areas with high concentrations of nerve endings or locations where specific pressure can trigger autonomic responses. The priests may have been working from empirical tradition rather than anatomical knowledge, but they had identified techniques that produced real physiological effects. The purpose of the physical preparation was to place the subject in an altered state, a condition of heightened suggestibility, reduced critical thinking, and blurred boundaries between self and environment. In this state, the psychological interventions that followed would be more effective. What happened next is described in the records with a clinical detachment that makes the content more disturbing rather than less. The subject was exposed to standard opening protocols for 7 days. Physical interventions continued throughout, maintaining heightened receptivity. Psychological interventions included identity replacement narratives, deity invocation sequences, possession simulation, and boundary dissolution exercises. The subject showed expected resistance during days 1 through 4, decreasing resistance during days 5 and 6, and apparent acceptance by day 7. Compliance metrics met expected parameters. Recommendation: proceed to stage 3. Each of these named interventions can be partially reconstructed from more detailed texts that describe the procedures used. Identity replacement narratives involve telling the subject repeatedly that she was not who she thought she was, that she was in fact a vessel who had always existed for this purpose, that her memories of a previous life were illusions, and that her true nature was now being revealed through the preparation she was undergoing. These narratives were repeated continuously, hour after hour, reinforced by the physical interventions that kept her in a state of impaired critical thinking. Deity invocation sequences involved priests speaking to her as though she were a goddess, addressing her by divine names, treating her body as sacred space, and behaving in ways that assumed she was already inhabited by divine presence. This was not pretense. The priests genuinely believed, or at least genuinely behaved as though they believed, that the preparation protocol was making room for divine occupation of the subject's body. Possession simulation involved the priests demonstrating what occupation would look like, showing her other women who had completed the protocol, who spoke in altered voices, and claimed to channel divine messages, and who behaved in ways that appeared to confirm that they were no longer their original selves. Whether these women were genuinely dissociated or performing is impossible to determine from the records, but their examples serve to show Kier what was expected of her, what the end state of her transformation would look like. Boundary dissolution exercises involved physical and psychological interventions designed to break down the normal sense of separation between self and other. The subject was touched continuously by multiple priests while being told that she could not feel where her body ended and the divine began. She was required to repeat phrases that denied her individual existence. She was subjected to sensory experiences designed to overwhelm her capacity to maintain a coherent sense of embodied selfhood. Modern psychologists recognize these techniques as methods for inducing dissociative states, conditions in which the normal integration of consciousness, memory, and identity breaks down. The priests were not trying to convince Kie of anything through rational argument. They were trying to produce a neurological state in which her sense of self literally fragmented, creating the opening through which they believed divine presence could enter. Kia endured 7 days of these procedures. By the end, according to the records, she had stopped resisting. She had stopped asserting her own identity. She had begun speaking in phrases that the priests had taught her, identifying herself by the divine names they had given her, and behaving as though she were already the vessel they intended to create. But the preparation was not complete. The third stage was called the binding in temple documents, a name that described the process of fixing the new identity in place, ensuring that the subject could not spontaneously return to her previous sense of self. For Kia, the binding began on the 13th day of her preparation. The psychological logic was precise. The severing had cut her connections to her previous identity. The opening had created space for new content and induced states in which that content could be installed. But without binding, the effects might be temporary. The subject might gradually reconstruct her previous sense of self and might reassert the identity that had been so carefully destroyed. The binding was designed to prevent this. It created conditions under which the new identity would become self-reinforcing, in which any attempt to return to the previous self would trigger responses that pushed the subject back toward the vessel identity. The primary technique was what the records call pain association. The subject was required to recite phrases describing her previous identity, her name, her family, her homeland, and her memories while being subjected to pain. The association between those concepts and suffering was established through repetition. Eventually, merely thinking about her previous self would trigger the anticipation of pain, creating an automatic aversion that reinforced the new identity. The reverse association was also created. When the subject spoke in her new identity using the divine name, speaking as the vessel she was being trained to become. She was given relief water when she was thirsty, food when she was hungry, warmth when she was cold, and physical comfort when she had been suffering. The association between the vessel identity and relief was established through the same repetition that created the aversion to the previous self. Modern behavioral psychology recognizes this as classical conditioning, the same basic process that Pavlov demonstrated with dogs applied systematically to human identity. The priests may not have understood the mechanism, but they understood the outcome. Subjects who had been through the binding process experienced automatic discomfort when contemplating their previous selves and automatic relief when inhabiting their new identities. The binding also included what the records call social reinforcement. Other women who had completed the protocol were brought to interact with subjects in the binding stage. These women, already transformed and already identifying as vessels, demonstrated the behaviors expected and provided social validation for the new identity. They welcomed subjects into their community, treating them as fellow vessels, as sisters in divine service. Modern social psychology recognizes the power of group belonging to reinforce individual identity. Humans are social creatures who define themselves partly through their relationships with others, by providing a community that accepted only the vessel identity. The priests created social pressure that reinforced everything the conditioning had established. The binding took approximately 2 days for most subjects. For Kia, it took 3, a duration that the records note as indicating exceptional psychological resilience. Now successfully redirected to vessel integration. By the end of the binding, Kie no longer spontaneously thought of herself as Kie of Mitanni. When asked her name, she gave the divine name she had been assigned, Mutum Hib. Mut is in a festival. When asked about her past, she described herself as having always been a vessel, temporarily inhabited by a foreign identity that had now been removed. When asked about her feelings, she described peace, clarity, purpose, and the resolution of internal conflict that comes when competing identities are eliminated and only one remains. But the preparation still had one stage remaining. The final stage was called the completion of temple documents. a name that described both its position in the sequence and its function of finalizing the transformation that the previous stages had accomplished. The completion ceremony was not primarily psychological. The psychological work was done. Kia was, by all observable measures, successfully transformed. She identified as Mutton-Heb. She showed no signs of her previous personality. She behaved as the vessel the priests had created. The completion was ritual, a formal recognition of transformation, a ceremonial installation of divine presence, and an initiation into the community of priestesses who served the temple through their vessel status. It was also, according to the fragmentary records that describe it, the occasion for the subject to be used for the first time in her new role. The ceremony took place in a different chamber, larger than the ones used for preparation, decorated with gold leaf and precious stones, and lit by dozens of oil lamps that filled the space with flickering light. Senior priests attended, including those who rarely descended to the underground complex. The subject was dressed for the first time since her preparation began in white linen that designated her new status with gold jewelry that marked her as temple property. What happened during the ceremony is described in the records with less clinical precision than the preparation stages, partly because the ceremony was considered sacred rather than procedural, partly because what occurred was understood differently by participants than by observers. The records indicate that the subject was required to demonstrate her transformation. She was presented with stimuli associated with her previous identified objects, names and images, and required to show no recognition, no response, and no evidence of the person she had been. She was asked questions that only Kia of Mitanni could have answered, and required to express genuine confusion about why anyone would expect her to know such things. She passed these tests. She showed no recognition. She expressed confusion that seemed genuine. Whatever Kia of Mitanni had known, Mum-Heb apparently did not. The records then indicate that the subject was received into service, a phrase whose meaning can be inferred from context, but whose details the texts do not explicitly describe. The senior priests participated in rituals that the texts identify as union with the divine and establishment of the vessel's function. The subject's role in these rituals was both ceremonial and physical. She was used in ways that marked her new status and that the priests believed established her connection to the divine power she was now supposed to channel. The completion ceremony for Kia took place on the 15th day after her descent to the chambers. She emerged the following morning as Mut-Mb, priestess of the Temple of Ammon at Karnak, vessel of divine power, woman with no past. She would serve in the temple for the next 11 years until her death from an illness that the records describe as wasting of the body without visible cause, a description that modern physicians recognize as consistent with the long-term effects of prolonged psychological trauma and the physical interventions documented during her preparation. She was 22 when she entered the chamber. She was 33 when she died. And according to every surviving record, she showed no evidence of ever remembering who she had been before. Let me tell you now about 4 other women who underwent this preparation. Women whose outcomes were different from Kia as in ways that reveal the range of what these rituals produced. Nefertari of Kush was brought to the temple complex at Luxor in approximately 1170 years before the Common Era. She was 25 years old, the daughter of a Kushite nobleman who had resisted Egyptian expansion into Nubia. She was captured during the sack of her father's compound and transported to Egypt with approximately 40 other captive women. The evaluation process identified her as exceptional, even more resistant than Kia, more psychologically resilient, and more firmly rooted in her identity. The evaluators noted that she might be unsuitable for standard preparation and that her resistance capacity was so high that the protocol might fail entirely. The senior priests decided to proceed anyway. Nefertari's psychological strength made her valuable precisely because of what she could become if successfully transformed. A weak vessel was of limited use. A strong vessel, one that had contained a powerful identity before being emptied, was believed to channel divine power more effectively. The preparation followed the standard protocol through the severing and opening stages. Nefertari resisted at every point. She refused to stop speaking her name, despite the pain this caused. She refused to destroy her possessions, forcing the priests to do it themselves while she watched. She maintained her sense of identity through the sensory deprivation and stimulation cycles using techniques she had apparently learned from Kushite spiritual traditions that valued mental discipline. By the end of the opening stage, day 12 of her preparation, she was still substantially herself. The priests documented their concern. Subject maintains identity coherence beyond all recorded precedent. Standard protocols are insufficient. Recommend extended measures. The extended measures are described in a separate papyrus that was sealed with warnings, indicating its content was suitable only for senior initiates. Modern scholars who have translated this document recognize it as describing what is now called extreme psychological pressure. Methods that go beyond the standard protocol into territory that even the priests considered exceptional. Nefertari was subjected to complete isolation for a period the records describe as until compliance. No food, minimal water, no human contact of any kind, and no sensory stimulation except the slow passage of time in absolute darkness. Modern research on isolation torture indicates that most humans begin experiencing serious psychological effects within 2 to 3 days. Complete psychological breakdown typically occurs within 7 to 14 days. Never lasted 19 days. The record of her breakdown, written by a priest who checked on her periodically, describes the progression in clinical terms. Day 1 through day 5. Subject continues. Verbal resistance. Shouts name and identity affirmations. Pounding walls, demands release. Day 6 through day 10. Verbal resistance is decreasing. The subject was observed talking to self, sometimes in the Kushite language and sometimes in Egyptian. The content appears to be self-encouragement, memory recitation, and maintenance exercises. On day 11 through day 14, the subject was largely silent and observed sitting motionlessly for extended periods. When checked, the subject appeared aware but did not respond to speech. From day 15 through day 18, the subject was observed engaging in repetitive behaviors, rocking, hand movements, and vocalization of sounds without apparent meaning. When checked, did not appear to recognize the observer. Day 19, the subject signaled compliance. Method assumed a posture of submission. Spoke the divine name assigned during opening. Requested continuation of protocol, voice, and manner entirely different from previous observations. Subject appears to have achieved severance through isolation. Recommend proceeding to binding with maximum intensity to capitalize on the current psychological state. Nefertari was removed from isolation and processed through binding and completion within the next 4 days. She emerged as Hathor Emet, priestess of the Temple of Luxor, and served for 27 years until her death. But the records note something unusual about her service. Unlike other vessels who appeared genuinely transformed, Hathor Emet showed what the priests described as occasional recurrence of prior patterns. She would sometimes speak words in the Kushite language, apparently without awareness that she was doing so. She would sometimes fail to recognize people she should have known in her vessel identity. She would sometimes exhibit behaviors that seemed more consistent with Nefertari than with Hathor Emet. Attention of QAnon was brought to the temple complex at Memphis in approximately 1150 years before the Common Era. She was 19 years old, the youngest daughter of a Canaanite merchant whose trading operations had violated Egyptian commercial regulations. Her capture was punitive rather than military. She was seized from her father's household as a penalty for his offenses and transported to Egypt as property of the state. The evaluation identified her as suitable for preparation, but the notes indicate concern about her youth and what the evaluators described as insufficient psychological development. She had not yet fully formed the strong identity that the preparation was designed to destroy. She had not yet accumulated the psychological resources that the priests intended to harvest. The senior priests decided to proceed despite these concerns. Younger subjects sometimes transformed more easily precisely because they had less identity to sever, which might prove to be a straightforward case. She was not. The preparation proceeded normally through the first stage. Isutov showed distress but not exceptional resistance. The severing techniques appeared to work as expected. She stopped asserting her identity. She stopped defending her memories. But during the opening stage, something went wrong. The records describe it as physical failure during divine preparation. The specific intervention that caused the failure is not named, but the description indicates that Isidnofred experienced a physiological crisis, a sudden collapse, a cessation of breathing, and an inability to be revived despite the efforts of the priests who attended her. She died on the 8th day of her preparation at 19 years of age, in a chamber 47 steps below the temple of T. Her death was documented in unusual detail, suggesting that it was considered significant beyond the loss of a single subject. The subject demonstrated unacceptable fragility during standard opening procedures. Physical constitution inadequate to protocol requirements. Death occurred despite the absence of interventions beyond normal parameters. Recommendation: revise evaluation criteria to better identify subjects with insufficient physical resilience. Implement additional screening for subjects under 20 years of age. This is the only recorded instance in surviving documents of the preparation protocol being modified as a result of a subject's death. The recommended age screening appears in later evaluation texts, suggesting that Isidnofred's death did produce at least one lasting change to temple practices. But the documents also reveal something about how the priests understood their work. They did not question whether the protocol itself was too harsh. They did not consider that perhaps transforming human beings through weeks of physical and psychological torture might sometimes kill them, regardless of their initial health. They concluded only that the evaluation process needed to better identify subjects who could survive what they were going to experience. That the problem was selecting inappropriate raw material, not the manufacturing process itself. Modern readers recognize this as the logic of any system that processes human beings as objects. The failure is always in the material, never in the method. The solution is always better selection, never questioning whether the entire enterprise is worth the human cost. Isidnofred was buried somewhere in the Memphis temple complex. No record indicates where. Her family in Canaan was never informed of her fate. For the temple records, she was simply a failed subject, raw material that proved unsuitable for the product the priests were trying to create. Tazarat of Libya was brought to the temple complex at Heliopolis in approximately 1190 years before the Common Era. She was 28 years old, older than most subjects, and the widow of a Libyan tribal leader who had been killed during Egyptian military operations in the Western Desert. She was captured along with other survivors of the defeated tribe and transported to Egypt as part of the general captive population. The evaluation identified her as unusually psychologically sophisticated in ways that most captives were not. Apparently, she was experienced in the mental disciplines that some tribal cultures taught their women. The evaluators noted that she might resist the preparation with particular effectiveness, but that this same sophistication made her potentially valuable if successfully transformed. What the evaluators did not detect, and what the records reveal only through later events, was that Tarot had a plan. She had heard stories about the temple preparations from other captive women during the transport to Egypt. She understood, at least in general terms, what awaited her, and she had decided during the weeks of travel that she would survive it not by resisting openly, which she understood would only intensify the treatment, but by pretending to break while secretly maintaining her identity beneath the appearance of transformation. The preparation proceeded according to standard protocols. Tazit showed the expected progression: initial resistance, gradual breakdown, and eventual apparent acceptance. She performed the compliance behaviors. She spoke the divine names. She identified as the vessel she was supposed to become, but inside. According to what the records reveal through the consequences of her actions, she remained tacit. She maintained this deception for approximately 6 months after her completion ceremony. She served as a priestess of the Temple of Ra. She participated in rituals. She fulfilled the duties expected of vessels. She showed no signs that the priests could detect of her previous identity. Then, during the night of a festival, when temple security was reduced, she attempted to escape. The escape nearly succeeded. She made it beyond the temple walls into the streets of Heliopolis before she was recognized by a temple guard who happened to be returning from personal business in the city. She fought when they tried to capture her, injuring 2 guards before she was subdued. The records of what followed are among the most disturbing in the temple archives. Subject Srit, assigned vessel name Ra-Heb, has demonstrated complete failure of transformation. The subject who escaped during the festival of the inundation was recaptured approximately 3 hours. Later, Anne has revealed under questioning that apparent compliance during preparation and service was deceptive. The subject maintained her previous identity throughout, performing vessel behaviors while internally remaining the foreign woman she was before intake. This case represents an unprecedented security failure. The implications are severe. If one subject can deceive the protocols, others may have done so as well. All current vessels must be reevaluated. Preparation protocols must be reviewed for vulnerabilities. And subject Tassarat must be processed in a manner that ensures no future subject will consider similar deception. The processing of Tarat is described in a sealed papyrus that bears warnings even more severe than those attached to Nefertari's extended measures. The document is damaged and fragmentary, but what survives indicates that Tarat was subjected to procedures that went far beyond anything in the standard protocol. Procedures designed not merely to break her, but to make an example of her. To produce a result so extreme that any future subject who contemplated deception would understand the consequences. The document describes approximately 40 days of intervention. It describes the involvement of senior priests from multiple temple complexes gathered specifically to develop and implement methods adequate to Tarat's resistance. It describes the systematic destruction, not merely of her identity, but of her capacity for coherent thought, her ability to form memories, and her basic cognitive functions. At the end of the 40 days, the records indicate that Tassaret no longer spoke. Not that she refused to speak, but that she was no longer capable of speech. The language centers of her brain had apparently been damaged beyond recovery. She could not communicate, could not understand communication, and could not function in any way that required symbolic thought. She died at approximately 31 years of age. The cause of death is recorded as failure of the body after prolonged insufficiency of the mind. Meritone of Syria was brought to the temple complex at Thebes in approximately 1230 years before the Common Era. She was 21 years old, the daughter of a Syrian priest who had served a god that the Egyptians did not recognize. She was captured when Egyptian forces destroyed her father's temple and killed her father along with most of his followers. The evaluation identified her as exceptional in a different way from other subjects, not because of her resistance capacity, but because of her psychological structure. She showed what the evaluators described as an unusual capacity for internal dissociation, an ability to separate her conscious experience from her external circumstances that seemed to be the result of religious training in her father's tradition. Modern psychologists would recognize this description as indicating someone who had already learned dissociative techniques, possibly as part of spiritual practices in her original religion. For the Egyptian priests, this was both an opportunity and a challenge. She might transform more easily than most subjects because she already knew how to separate herself from her circumstances. But she might also use that same capacity to protect a core identity that the preparation could not reach. The preparation proceeded with Meetin showing unusual responses. She did not resist in the expected ways. She did not fight the severing or the opening. She seemed to flow through the protocols with a detachment that the priests found difficult to interpret. Was she already transforming? Or was she using her dissociative capacity to protect something the protocols could not touch? The records indicate that the priests decided to treat her as a successful transformation and proceed through completion. Whatever was happening internally, her external compliance was complete. She spoke the vessel name. She performed the vessel behaviors. She showed no signs of her previous identity. She was assigned as Nath, priestess of the Temple of Ammon at Thebes, and served in that role for 17 years. During those 17 years, she became one of the most renowned oracles in Egypt. People traveled from across the kingdom to receive her prophecies. Pharaohs consulted her on matters of state. Her reputation for accuracy was extraordinary. She seemed to know things she could not possibly have known, to see connections that were invisible to others, and to channel divine wisdom with a clarity that other vessels could not match. The priests celebrated her as their greatest success proof that the preparation protocols could produce. Vessels of extraordinary power. They documented her prophecies, studied her methods, tried to understand what made her different from other vessels so they could replicate her success. But fragments that survive suggest a different interpretation. A priest who observed her closely over many years wrote a private document that was not included in the official temple records. A document discovered in 19th century excavations and held in European archives since then. I have watched Neitha Maquette for many years, and I have come to believe something the other priests do not see. When she prophesies, she is not channeling the goddess Neith. She is channeling the foreign woman she was before her preparation. The things she knows because Meriton knew them. The insights she provides come from a mind trained in the Syrian traditions of seeing. The vessel is not empty. The vessel is occupied by the very person we tried to remove. If I am right, then our greatest success is actually our greatest failure. We have not created a divine vessel. We have created a shell that the original woman uses to survive, pretending to be what we made her while secretly remaining what she always was. The prophecies are real, but they do not come from the gods. They come from a Syrian priest's daughter who learned to see in ways we do not understand. I have not reported this observation. What would be the point? She is useful. Her prophecies are valued. If we exposed her, we would only lose a valuable asset and reveal that our protocols can fail in ways we cannot detect. Better to let her continue as she is, serving the temple in her way, believing whatever she believes, being whatever she actually is beneath the name we gave her. Whether this priest's interpretation was correct cannot be determined from the surviving evidence. Meritaton or Neith Maquette died at approximately 38 years of age of causes the records describe as natural illness. No examination of her psychological state was conducted. No attempt was made to determine whether she had truly transformed or had merely learned to perform transformation while remaining herself. Modern archaeology and forensic analysis have provided physical evidence that supports what the temple documents describe. Excavations at temple sites throughout Egypt have uncovered underground chambers matching the descriptions in the preparation texts. At Karnak, archaeologists in 1923 discovered a complex of rooms beneath the Temple of Ammon that had been sealed since approximately the 8th century before the Common Era. The rooms contained obsidian slabs with leather attachments, ceramic vessels bearing residue of substances consistent with the preparations described in the texts, and skeletal remains of at least 4 individuals who appeared to have died in the complex. Analysis of the skeletal remains conducted in the 1980s using techniques not available to the original. Excavators revealed patterns consistent with prolonged confinement and specific forms of physical intervention. Bone abnormalities suggested extended immobilization. Evidence of healed and unhealed injuries suggested repeated physical trauma over periods of weeks or months. The age at death for the recovered individuals ranged from approximately 20 to approximately 35 years, consistent with the age range documented in the temple texts. At Luxor, Excavations in 1954 uncovered similar chambers beneath the temple complex. These chambers contained what appeared to be residue of natron solutions in stone basins consistent with the description of natron baths in the preparation texts. Chemical analysis confirmed the presence of natron compounds at concentrations that would cause chemical burns on prolonged contact with skin, exactly as the texts describe. At Memphis, excavations in the 1970s discovered burial sites associated with temple personnel that included individuals who did not appear to be native Egyptians. Isotopic analysis of bones and teeth indicated that these individuals had spent their childhoods in regions corresponding to Qanon, Nubia, and Libya. The source regions from which the texts indicate captive women were obtained. The burial practices suggested low-status temple personnel rather than honored priestesses, consistent with the fate of subjects who did not survive preparation or who were considered unsuccessful transformations. Modern pharmacological analysis of residues found in ceramic vessels from these sites has identified compounds consistent with quidnas with psychoactive substances known from ancient Egyptian medical texts. Some of these compounds would produce dissociative effects when absorbed through the skin or inhaled as smoke effects that the priests would have attributed to divine presence, but that modern science recognizes as neurochemical alterations produced by specific molecular interactions. The physical evidence does not prove that the temple documents are accurate in every detail. Archaeological evidence rarely proves anything with the certainty that written records can provide. But the physical evidence is consistent with what the documents describe. The chambers exist, the residues exist, the skeletal evidence exists. Whatever happened in those underground spaces, it left traces that 3,000 years did not entirely erase. Modern psychologists and neuroscientists who have analyzed the preparation protocols described in the temple texts recognize techniques that remain effective for producing psychological transformation today. The severing stage employs methods that modern researchers call identity attack, systematic degradation of the beliefs, relationships, and physical markers that allow a person to maintain a coherent sense of self. The combination of physical pain, sensory manipulation, and denial of identity validation produces a state in which the normal psychological substrate of selfhood becomes destabilized. The opening stage employs methods that produce what is now called dissociative trance, altered states of consciousness in which the normal integration of perception, memory, and identity breaks down. The combination of pharmacological substances, physical manipulation, and psychological suggestion creates conditions in which new beliefs and identities can be installed more easily than they could in a normal waking state. The binding stage employs methods that modern behavioral psychology calls conditioning. The systematic association of specific thoughts and behaviors with specific consequences to create automatic responses that bypass conscious decision. The association of the previous identity with pain and the vessel identity with relief produces exactly the kind of learned response that modern conditioning research predicts. The completion stage employs methods that modern social psychology calls ritual initiation, formal ceremonies that mark transition from one status to another, and that creates psychological commitment to the new status through public declaration and group acceptance. Each of these techniques is still used today, though in different contexts and usually in less extreme forms. Military training uses identity attack methods to break down civilian identity and install soldier identity. Religious conversion experiences use dissociative techniques to create openness to new beliefs. Therapeutic treatments for addiction and trauma use conditioning methods to modify automatic responses. Initiation rituals for organizations from fraternities to gang to secret societies use group acceptance ceremonies to cement new identities. What made the Egyptian temple protocols unusual was not the individual techniques, but their combination, their intensity, and their explicit purpose. The priests were not trying to produce soldiers or believers or members of organizations. They were trying to produce what they considered divine vessels, human beings whose original identities had been completely replaced by something else. Whether they achieved this goal in the metaphysical sense they believed is obviously beyond scientific evaluation. But the evidence suggests that they often achieved it in the psychological sense that they produced women who genuinely experienced themselves as different people than they had been, who genuinely could not access memories or personality, traits or identity markers from their previous lives who genuinely functioned, as though the preparation had replaced one person with another. Modern research on dissociative identity suggests that such radical transformation of self-experience is possible at least for some individuals under some conditions. The human sense of identity is not as stable or unified as it normally feels. Under sufficient pressure, the psychological structures that normally maintain a continuous sense of self can fragment, allowing genuinely different modes of experience and self-understanding to emerge. The temple priests may not have understood the neuroscience, but they understood empirically what worked. And their empirical understanding, refined over centuries of practice, produced methods that modern science recognizes as genuinely capable of transforming human psychology in the ways the ancient texts describe. For Kia of Mitanni, who was 22 years old when she was captured in Syria, who endured 14 days of preparation that destroyed everything she had been, who lived for 11 more years as Mutum, Heb, before her body gave up what her mind had lost, who died at 33 years of age, having never again spoken her own name. For Nefertari of Kush, who was 25 years old when she was captured in Nubia, who resisted longer than any recorded subject and was broken through 19 days of isolation that no human mind can endure intact, who served for 27 years as Hathor Maquette, while traces of her true self surfaced in moments she may never have been aware of, who died at 52 years of age, still speaking words in the language of her people. For Yasatnefort of Canaan, who was 19 years old when she was seized from her father's household, who did not survive the opening stage of preparation, who died on the 8th day of her transformation because her body could not endure what her mind was being subjected to, who was buried somewhere beneath the temple of Ta and whose family never learned what became of her. For Tesa of Libya, who was 28 years old when she was captured after her husband's death, who survived the preparation by pretending to be broken while secretly remaining whole, who nearly escaped only to be recaptured and subjected to 40 days of procedures that destroyed her capacity for thought itself, who lived for 3 more years as a warning to others before dying at 31 of a body that had no mind left to direct it. For Matan of Syria, who was 21 years old when she was captured after her father's temple was destroyed, who may have survived by using the preparation rather than being destroyed by it, who served for 17 years as one of Egypt's most famous oracles, while possibly remaining herself beneath the vessel identity, who died at 38 and took the truth of what she was to her grave. For the approximately 300 women per year who were selected for intensive preparation during the height of the New Kingdom. For the 83% who never emerged with their personalities intact. For the 61% who died within 5 years of completing the rituals. For the 12% who survived physically but were described as present but empty. For the 7% who became oracles and priestesses and vessels of divine power at the cost of everything they had been. For the thousands who underwent this process across centuries of Egyptian temple practice, for the names that were taken from them, for the identities that were destroyed, for the women who entered those chambers and the empty vessels who emerged. They were not willing participants. They were captives, women taken in war, seized as punishment, removed from their families and homelands, and transported to temples where they were transformed against their will into something their captives found useful. They did not choose divine service. They were selected for it, evaluated like livestock, processed like raw material, manufactured into finished products through weeks of systematic psychological destruction. They did not become vessels because the gods chose them. They became vessels because the priests broke them using techniques refined over centuries, documented with precision, applied with the methodical consistency of any industrial process. Their suffering was not sacred, it was policy. Their transformation was not divine. It was psychological destruction induced through torture. Their silence in the historical record was not accidental. It was the point. The preparation protocols were designed to erase not just individual identity, but any trace that there had ever been a person to erase. This is what the Egyptian high priests did to captive women during secret rituals that the ancient world kept hidden for 3,000 years. This is what the chambers beneath the temples were for, not storage, not administration, not any of the mundane purposes that archaeologists initially assumed. This is what the preparation protocols actually involved. Not mystical transformation, but systematic. Psychological destruction using methods that modern science recognizes as genuinely effective for breaking human minds. This is what the vessel priestesses actually were. Not holy women touched by the divine, but traumatized captives whose original selves had been destroyed and replaced with identities their captors found useful. The temples are ruins now. The priests are dust. The protocols have not been used for over 2,000 years. But the knowledge of what happened there persists in fragments, in documents translated only for specialists. In physical evidence that confirms the written record, in the recognition of modern psychology that these ancient techniques work. And somewhere in museum archives around the world, there are human remains recovered from those temple sites. Bones that once belonged to women who entered those chambers and never truly left. Physical evidence of lives that were destroyed so that temples could have vessels and oracles and priestesses. They deserve to be remembered, not as vessels, not as priestesses, not as the divine servants the temples claim to create. As Kia, as Nefertari, as Isnorfrit, as Teret, as Miraton, as the women they were before the priests took them below. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand ancient Egypt, but has only seen the pyramids and the gold. The temples had secrets. The chambers were real. The women deserve to be remembered.